Yeah, welcome to Cinelit. We are back again. My name is Adam Marsh, and I am joined by Cinelit's resident expert, Darrell Buxton. How are you, Darrell?
I'm fine, Adam. Hi, everyone. Hi to all the listeners, and looking forward to today.
Okay, so today we're going to do another one of our 5 Reasons to Love podcasts that we started with Brian Trenchard-Smith a few weeks ago. We've carried on and did 5 Reasons to Love RKO, and today we are doing it one of your selections, Darrell, Mr. Julien Temple.
That's right, Adam. Yeah. As you'll see, he's a filmmaker who doesn't really fit into that easy sort of bracket. You know, it's difficult to pick 5 films because his work overlaps so much. There's so much crossover in there and so many repeated themes and so on. So we'll bring all this out as we speak.
His career in movies is what we're generally going to be talking about today. But obviously, he was a very influential music video director. So, yeah, he was constantly on people's TV screens throughout the 1980s and 90s without people really even knowing it in many ways. So where do you want to start, Darrell? Do you want to start at the beginning?
I think we'll go through sort of chronologically, I think, Adam, and kick off with the Great Rock and Roll Swindle.
Obviously, I'm a wee baby, Darrell. I'm a wee baby in this world.
And I'm an old punk, so...
Well, I was born in 1976, so right in the middle of this being filmed. It's not something I grew up with, punk. It was always something that was a historical thing. It was something in the past for me. So when I watched The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, all I could think about was, like, how could anyone take this seriously? To the point where he had to go and film a documentary, The Filth and the Fury, 30 years later to put the band's point of view across. This film doesn't appear to be serious to me.
No, I was looking up some stuff online over the weekend, and there's a poster called York Chaser on the IMDb who posted in 2005 about Great Rock and Roll Swindle. This movie should come as a double pack with The Filth and the Fury. So we'll talk a little about the whole process of making Great Rock and Roll Swindle and how it all came about as we go. A little bit of history, first of all. I mean, the first thing to say is that punk movies, I taught a course at Quad 3 or 4 years ago on punk rock cinema. And the thing that I told my class then was that most of the films that I was showing sort of came along in the early 80s. You know, there wasn't really anybody sort of documenting punk as it happened and getting the films out into the cinema. You've got people like Don Letts and Wolfgang Bald who were sort of filming the London scene as it occurred, but they were doing it on a sort of amateur basis, and even their footage didn't really get seen until some years later. And as always with the film business, as we've said during other podcasts, we said this about the BMX craze when we were talking about Brian Trenchard-Smith. You know, a trend happens, the movies dive in to try and capture it, and it takes them 3 years, you know. So that's part of what happened with the Great Rock and Roll Swindle. The project actually started in, you know, as the Pistols were sort of at their peak. Malcolm McLaren, their sort of shady manager, came up with the idea of, you know, let's make a movie. And the first person or the first team that he hired were an old pal of Quad's, Michael Armstrong, who came as a guest to one of our festivals a few years ago. And Michael and the horror movie director Pete Walker, who'd made a series of savage, terrifying films in the mid-70s, Pete and Mike were hired to concoct a Pistols movie. And Mike wrote a script called The Star Is Dead, which you can now buy in paperback form. You can actually read his script. And Pete Walker was going to direct this. And it would have had the Pistols playing themselves, or sort of, you know, cartoony, thinly veiled versions of themselves.
Well, didn't McLaren say that he wanted it to be like the Sex Pistols version of A Hard Day's Night?
He did. And what Michael did in response to that was he'd made a film called Eskimo Nell a few years earlier, which was, it's often cited as being the very best of the British sex comedies of the 70s. Now, to be the best British sex comedy of the 70s might not sound like something you want to aspire to, but people do say it is the best one.
It does sound like it's damning with faint praise, doesn't it?
It is a little, yeah. But I think people enjoy Eskimo Nell because it takes a dig at the film business. It's a sex comedy about making a sex comedy. And what Michael did with his Pistols film, he wrote a script about the Sex Pistols making a movie. And he basically took the plot of Eskimo Nell, which is various backers come in, a bit like the producers, that sort of thing, you know. They try and get different backers to fund the film, and they all come in. They've all got their own idea about what the film should be. And the Pistols are sort of caught up in the middle of all this. And the movie's going to be a Musketeers film. So, you know, try and imagine that. Although that would rather fit in with Julien Temple's whole approach to punk and to music of that era, which is he often looks at the subjects of his films as though they are making history, and he compares that to historical events from the past, and often puts old movie footage or even recreates vivid scenes from history and sort of edits those into his film. So you'll get a shot of the Pistols, or you'll get Joe Strummer, or you'll get Dr. Feelgood, or whoever he's making a film about, and you'll cut to Laurence Olivier and Richard III, or you'll cut to a recreation of a sort of peasants' revolt or something, you know, and so I can see that whole sort of combo of the Musketeers and the Pistols maybe in a funny way appealing to Julian, and I wonder if he ever read Michael's script, but that movie never happened. And then Malcolm McLaren dived in and obviously was thinking, what can I do that will be the most controversial thing? And hired Russ Meyer. He tried the British sex movie guys, and he then went to get the equivalent in America. But again, that was sort of one day shooting, and then Meyer and McLaren fell out, and Russ went back to America. And so next up was Julian himself. He'd made a documentary called The Sex Pistols #1, which seemed to be a sort of personal art project that he was doing in the 70s. He'd got footage of the Pistols from TV news coverage and so on, and he'd got a bit of live footage as well, and interviews and things like that, and he threw it all together as a collage, as a little short film. And obviously McLaren and the sort of Pistols entourage got wind of this, and in the light of losing Pete Walker and losing Russ Meyer, they then thought, hey, maybe this kid can do something, you know. So they hired Julian, and I think Malcolm probably saw him as being quite a malleable, sort of easy to manipulate sort of person. And the film took until 1980 to come out. The Pistols had been finished for almost 3 years by then. And the movie came out, and it did okay at the box office, but yeah, it didn't have the impact that it would have done had it come out 2 years earlier. But yeah, it's an interesting document. It's fascinating to watch in tandem with Filth and the Fury, which, as you say, Adam, was sort of made almost as a sort of rejoinder, you know, as a means of getting the Pistols to have their say, because Johnny Rotten took no part in the Great Rock and Roll Swindle, and he's billed in the credits, because he's used in sort of film footage and so on. He's billed simply as the collaborator. They don't even use his name. They don't call him Rotten. They don't call him John Lydon. He's the collaborator. Those that have seen the film will know it's a mixture, a bit like Julian's Sex Pistols #1. It's a mixture of film footage. You get things like the Bill Grundy interview on there, live concert footage, shots of the Pistols doing their Jubilee boat trip down the River Thames and so on. In typical Julian style, there's things cut in about what else is going on in and around Britain at that same time. So as you get in all of Julian's rock documentaries, there's always footage of sort of strikes and police brutality, and whoever the politicians were at the time, Margaret Thatcher was just sort of starting to rise to power. So it's this whole interesting little collage. And then interspersed in with that, you've got this character in a gimp mask who's sort of talking in McLaren's voice. I've no idea who's actually in the sort of S&M gear, you know, but and they're reading out McLaren's sort of rules of how to create chaos in the pop industry. And this is the side that John Lydon took offence to, because the film depicts the Pistols as being very much a McLaren creation and very much his puppets. And as any fan knows, they were far from that.
Well, that was kind of like a little mini narrative in pop music around that period, wasn't it? The Svengali, sort of like the person behind it all, creating these bands. I guess from like the Monkees onwards, you know. Yeah,
it had been the case really in Britain since the early 60s. You'd have people like Larry Parnes and then famously Brian Epstein with the Beatles, you know. But I think Epstein with the Beatles is an interesting sort of precursor to McLaren and the Pistols, because Epstein couldn't tell John Lennon or George Harrison or Paul or Ringo what to do. You know, he might have tried and he might have thought he was in charge, but you're not going to tell John Lennon, do this, do that, go there, are you? You know, and it was the same, I think, with McLaren and the Pistols, a similar sort of relationship where one guy thought he was in charge and the band knew they were in charge.
It reminded me, as I was watching, it reminded me of Frank Zappa's 200 Motels. As I was watching it, in the sort of like shambolic, thrown together kind of way.
Yeah, very, very free form, and anything goes, and you don't know what's coming next. Yeah.
And also, what struck me as well is like it had the unfortunate situation, is like possibly the least charismatic Pistol being heavily involved in the production. You know, you've lost Johnny Rotten. Sid Vicious, for all his faults, had something of a charisma about him.
Yeah,
and yet you've got Steve Jones traipsing around the world being your focal character. It's not the ideal, is it?
Not at all. No.
We do get some interesting cameos and interesting like little sidelines, like the whole bit in Brazil with Ronnie Biggs.
Yeah.
It's just such an unusual thing.
Well, that was weird at the time because we knew that Lydon had quit after their gig in San Francisco. You know, we weren't getting news back then as you do now, sort of instantly online. You know, you were sort of waiting to read it in the music papers. And I remember picking up NME or Record Mirror one day in sort of mid-1979, and there's an ad for a new Sex Pistols single, and I'd got no idea that this was on the way, and they were touting this singer called Ronnie Rotten. And I thought, what on earth is this? And gradually we sort of found out that, all right, Ronnie Biggs has joined the Sex Pistols. You know, they've been out to Brazil and they've done this arrangement with him, and he's now their lead vocalist on this sort of one-off single. So yeah, very, very strange. And you've got to remember that news didn't travel fast in those days. So it was all very, very odd at the time. And the film's a nice sort of document of that. Yeah, it does at least capture that whole bizarre story. But by focusing on stuff like that, rather than the genuine history of the band and the excitement of their emergence and those killer singles that they were bringing out one after the other, the film sort of misses out on all that, and it came along 3 years too late, and it feels like it.
Well, one of the things I was watching, it was like there's a wealth of performance footage in it as well, which must have been exciting at the time, because you didn't get, like you said, you took years for things to come around. You're waiting for the press. You didn't have music television. You didn't have avenues for live performance of bands at that time readily available.
Don't forget, you could barely, even if you'd been around in 77 or sort of early 78, you barely got a chance to see the Pistols live because everybody banned them. So
you say that, Darrell, but nearly every punk I've ever met went to that first Sex Pistols gig. So it must have been a 17,000 seater venue because literally everyone I know said they were there.
Yeah, they say it was at the 100 Club. I think it must have been at Wembley Stadium, really. Yeah.
Yeah, so that must have been an exciting thing to see that footage.
Yeah, I think that was the one thing that appealed to the hardcore fans, and they did sort of accept the movie because, hey, at least it's got the Jubilee boat footage. At least it's got some live footage from gigs at the Roxy and places like that. So, and even though Johnny Rotten's not billed in the credits, we are getting to see him on screen, and we're getting to see him in his prime, whereas we're getting to see Steve Jones as this sort of slightly dodgy, slightly bloated figure who's sort of losing it a bit, but we've got Rotten there, and we've got the rest of the band there, absolutely in their prime, and I wonder what McLaren's take on that was, whether he sort of thought, well, we've got to have this footage in, otherwise it's not a Pistols movie. But I bet he sort of rankled a bit at that. I bet there were sort of chats with Julien Temple saying, can you focus a bit more on Steve and Paul and what's happening now? McLaren put himself in a very weird position with that film. It must have killed him to know that the best bits of the movie were the bits where John Lydon's up front doing his stuff.
Well, yeah, but it's you can't hide that. You know what I mean?
Sure,
you can't hide that in the footage. It's there. The charisma, the performances, that it's just there. McLaren obviously trying to rewrite history a little bit and create his own little mythology over his role in things.
Yeah, which was his whole thing. That was how he sort of lived his life. What I like about the film is that. And again, I don't know whether this was Malcolm's idea or Julian's or a mixture of the two, but to get people doing little cameos, like Jess Conrad is in there, Liz Fraser, who'd starred in a few of those sex movies, yeah.
I was about to mention Liz Fraser, because it's like, you can plot the history of British film from the 1960s through to the 80s through Liz Fraser.
Oh,
she crops up in all kinds of stuff.
She was one of those people, a bit like Adrian Corrie, and Adrian Poster, the two Adrians. They seem to be in everything, going back years and years and years. You watch a film from the early 60s, or you watch something from the sort of mid to late 80s, and Liz is likely to turn up in it, and she's always good, and she always plays a very similar sort of character, but she's usually if not the best thing in the movie, she's usually the best thing in the scenes that she's in. She's a real scene stealer. But talking of scene stealers, you've got Irene Handel in there as well, who's the ultimate of that type of British actress, I think. Yeah. And had been doing it for decades longer even than Liz Fraser. And of course, to link it all in with the whole the sex film origins of the piece, you've got Mary Millington in there, who again, she was dead by the time this came out. So another mark of just how late this was, how delayed it was, and what a sort of troubled and disastrous production it was. I suppose we're lucky in a way that the film, as we see it, is such a fascinating document in many ways, because it was a complete mess. The one thing I would say, though, is anyone who wants a film about the history of the Sex Pistols, don't go near this, because it is almost complete fabrication. It is Malcolm's side of the story, and that guy on YouTube, on IMDb, was absolutely right. There are two sides to this story. You mentioned Sid, Adam, and the Filth and the Fury has clips from a really lucid and very funny sort of interview with Sid. He's sitting on a deck chair in a London park, smoking a fag, and talking to camera, and he's great. This is the Sid that you can understand why John Lydon would be best mates with this guy. He's sarcastic, he's funny, he's witty, and it's just a fantastic little 5 minutes that appears in The Filth and the Fury, and contrast that with the stuff that you've seen in films like DOA from later on, where he and Nancy Spungen are sort of rolling about on a bed, and they're talking about shooting up and so on. And he, I mean, in that interview in DOA, the American film, Sid actually falls asleep on camera. He just passes out on camera. Nancy sort of whinging at him, "Oh, Sid, wake up, man!" And contrast that with the deck chair interview in Filth and the Fury. It's two different people, and it's no surprise. I mean, the big talking point of Filth and the Fury was Johnny Rotten breaking down on camera and crying his eyes out as he talks about Sid. And when you watch that interview, you can see why, because you can see what he lost.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like, for as much as that period, it was about creating characters, I guess, the character of Johnny Rotten, the character of the Sex Pistols. And you do forget that they were real human beings as well. And Sid became that sort of like, well, he was the wastrel junkie who died tragically and murdered his girlfriend. You know, it's a sad ending to that story. But it also, you don't get the nuance when you just read the headlines like that. No. Filth and the Fury brought the nuance to that story.
And there's a real sense of what might have been as well. You know, you see Sid being jokey, funny, looking great. You know, I'm sure he was taking drugs at the time. We see him smoking a cigarette, but and he talks a little bit about drugs in that interview. But you can tell that he's not hooked on heroin at the point of this interview. And there's just such a sad sense. I mean, the guy's sort of 19 or 20 or something at the time he's being filmed. And you just think, really, you know, we're getting a picture there of what could have been, you know, and what was lost. He was never the most creative talent, but Sid sort of became the face of the Pistols for a while, and he had his own little cult following, which persists to this day, I think. And again, I think that's a little distorted by Great Rock and Roll Swindle. That's one of the culprits that has led to the sort of cult of Sid, I think.
So let's move on from the Sex Pistols, because he didn't work with just one band throughout his career. This kind of kickstarted Julien Temple into doing music videos, for which he would do a hell of a lot for artists like Gary Newman, Judas Priest, The Kinks, ABC, Depeche Mode, Dexys Midnight Runners, The Rolling Stones, Sade, Billy Idol, Janet Jackson, Neil Young, Kenny Rogers, Tom Petty, Swing Out Sister, Whitney Houston, Bryan Adams. He did the.
You're just saying names now, Adam.
Yeah, but the one that we're going to talk about, they worked with, was David Bowie.
Yeah.
And particularly, we're going to talk about his extended music pop promo, "Jazzin For Blue Jean." Now, Darrell, you're not much of a Bowie fan, are you, Darrell?
I'm not. No. I've
sarcasm.
I've only been buying his stuff since 1974. You know, and Diamond Dogs was the first album I ever bought, and David Live was the second album I ever bought, and I could go on. But...
Yeah. So you're coming at this from a massive Bowie fan angle.
Interestingly, Bowie was probably at the lowest point of his career at this time. In 1984, he released the album Tonight, which I think most Bowie fans would agree is pretty dire, you know.
Well,
and
I went through a period recently of re-listening to all of Bowie's 80s stuff, because he did that big box set of his 80s collection.
Yes,
80s thing. And he was known for reinventing himself throughout his career. The Thin White Duke, you know, the Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, all these kind of reinventions that he went throughout his career. And in Jazzin For Blue Jean, it's like he's been reincarnated as a bumbling sitcom, rom-com Hero. What is going on in this film? He's like Michael Crawford from Some Mothers Do Heaven in this, especially in the early part.
Yeah, I think Bowie's sense of humour was always very, very broad and very strange. He loved puns. You know, for instance, when U2 recorded an album called Acton Baby, Tin Machine did their live album and called it Oy Vey Baby. So and that's Bowie's idea of a joke. You know, it's not funny at all, but you know. When you're sitting backstage with the band and having a beer after a gig and someone comes up with that, it's probably the most hilarious thing in the world. And a lot of people would ditch things like that, and ridiculous puns that he would put into lyrics and things that other people might sort of discard and throw away after they've laughed at it once. He'd actually put on the front of an album. And so, yeah, he was always a bit strange when it came to humour and very broad. And I think that sort of feeds into Jazzin For Blue Jean.
That appears to be like what he was going for in the 80s. He seemed to be trying to broaden out his audience anyway.
What's interesting is I think Bowie fans sort of reacted a little bit against that, because there was this sort of suggestion, a little bit of sell out. Oh, you've signed a contract with a big record company, although he'd been with RCA before, Elvis's label, so you can't really throw that accusation at him. But I think there was, punks and sort of even people on the sort of new romantic scene at the time, because that had sort of come up from grassroots, and they'd all been ex-punks anyway. There was this big thing about artists selling out at the time and signing to major labels, and we hated it when that happened. When one of your favourite bands signed to a proper record company, it was like, oh, they're finished. They're all the creativity's gone out. And so we threw that at Bowie a little bit, and you almost couldn't, because Let's Dance was such a fantastic album that it didn't seem to fit that pattern of, artist signs big deal and then makes terrible LP. But we all thought, what's his new character going to be? We've had Aladdin Sane and Ziggy and all these other great characters, what's he going to do next? And Jazzin For Blue Jean came along, and this all sort of emerged out of Julian's love of the music video as a new art form. And there weren't all that many people making videos at that time. It was a brand new thing. MTV had started up, and they were desperate for product. And Julian was one of the first guys to sort of get in on it and say, hey, I'm tailored for this. This is perfect for me to make little promo films. And of course, what he did was develop the form. He started making films, as you say, with people like ABC, and sort of expanding the idea of what a pop video could be. Most people were just putting the band in front of a microphone, getting them to mime to their instruments and filming the song. Julian and one or two other artists started putting sound effects and dialogue in, and they'd have extra scenes at the start and at the end. And then the Blue Jean video comes along, the single from the Tonight album. They shot a conventional 3-minute video for it, but then Julian expanded that into a 21-minute film that was used as a short film shown in cinemas. I saw it with the Company of Wolves in 1984, and it works as a little short story on its own. And as you say, Bowie plays this weird sort of sitcom-type character, but he's also playing this sort of heightened version of himself, a very unflattering portrait of a sort of big rock star. And you've got these two David Bowies sort of vying against each other, both trying to get the girl. And Julian doing all kinds of flashy things in the video and making it into this great expansive sort of 20-minute short film. Very, very impressive at the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was well regarded at the time. It won the Grammy for best video short form, as it was called then, best music video as it would later become. And you can see why, because there was money thrown at it. It had a set, it had a story, it had all these things that you weren't expecting from a pop video before. And obviously, this is like 84, so it was around the same time as things like the Michael Jackson long form videos as well. So it was starting to become a thing. And like you said, like Julien Temple was right there in the middle of that. I must admit, I wasn't a big fan of this, to be honest with you, Darrell. I thought it was a bit hokey and a bit broad, and I don't know. I had David Bowie playing some sort of like window cleaner painter at the start, and he was like Jacko from Brushstrokes or something like that. It was like David Bowie doing Jacko from Brushstrokes. It was
I'm not disagreeing. It's. I think we gave it a lot of leeway simply because it was so new and so innovative. But it's maybe not one that holds up to repeat viewing, and maybe doesn't age all that well. And Bowie doesn't look all that cool in it. But I don't think he wanted to. I think he's sort of playing around with his persona in it. he didn't necessarily mix well with comedy and humour, and I think Julian comes out of this rather better than Bowie does. But yeah, for its time, and if you put yourself back into 1984 and think of what else was around at the time, as you say, we'd had Thriller, but this was like the British answer to that, you know, and I think it did impress in its own way, although yeah, it maybe doesn't hold up particularly well now. I suppose that brings us on to Absolute Beginners, which was Julian's next step in his career.
Yeah, Absolute Beginners. That's an interesting one. Its reputation tends to precede it, I think. We screened it at Quad last year.
Yes, yeah, as part of the musical season. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So, and I wanted to show on different types of musicals, rather than you just a classic range. So we got Absolute Beginners, we got 200 Motels and things like that on there. Now, the reputation for this is that it brought down the studio and nearly ruined the British film industry. Unfair?
Fairly true, I think. Yeah. And again, it's another instance of those that were there at the time have got a different sort of story to everyone else. And I'm a person, I pride myself on, if I don't like a movie, if I saw a film in sort of 1979 or 1990 or something and didn't like it, and I then revisit it 30 years later, I still tend not to like it. I don't change my mind, or I'm pretty good at sort of getting my opinion on a movie the first time I see it, when it first comes out. Absolute Beginners is one of those rare occasions where I've changed my mind. It was almost written off before it was made. It was written off while it was shooting by a certain breed of person, and that breed of person was the readers of NME. We NME readers were we were sort of up our own arses a bit at the time. You know, it was. There were certain bands you could like. It was so sort of blinkered, you know, and again, it was this business about if they're releasing stuff on Rough Trade or Factory Records or Small Wonder or whatever, they're great. You know, if John Peel plays them, they're great. Anything else, we despise, you know. And we sort of liked Julian because he'd worked with the Pistols and he'd worked with Bowie, you know, and that gave him a lot of leeway and a lot of credence with us. But then Absolute Beginners comes along, and it didn't have any reference points for that NME generation. It was based on Colin McKinney's novel, which Paul Weller was known to like, and had written a song called Absolute Beginners for the Jam, you know. And so, again, there was a little sense there of, Weller likes this novel, so it must be all right, you know. But Julien Temple hadn't really made a movie before. We'd seen his videos, and his videos seemed to be getting a little bit out of control by this point with things like Blue Jean. And the British film industry was at a stage there where it was being talked up by everybody, and there seemed to be money around. But you could sort of sense that it was a bit of a veneer, that things were one step away from coming crashing down, you know. And there was always this sense that Absolute Beginners might be the film that did that, even as it was being made. And we were getting reports that people like Sade, who we didn't like, were in it, you know, people like Slim Gaillard, you know, old jazz musicians like that were going to be part of it, who we didn't really know. Ray Davies was going to be in it, and we thought, there wasn't a sort of cult of the Kinks amongst our generation back then, and we sort of wrote him off as well. And the worst name for our generation was Patsy Kensit, who was the enemy of the enemy. You know, we just didn't take to her.
You weren't Eighth Wonder fans then?
Not at all. And then suddenly Julian throws her into the starring role of his movie, and it's like, this isn't going to be good, you know. And I went along to see it, and I have to say that A, I despised it, but B, I think that was because I'd written it off already because of all the factors that I've just mentioned. And then C, when I caught up with the film again about 4 or 5 years ago, when it came out on Blu-ray, and then seeing it again at Quad last year, I loved it. And the two differences for me were, A, seeing Ray Davies and Lionel Blair and Slim Gaillard and all of these people on screen I now knew a bit more about them. I now loved Ray Davies. I've got a lot of respect for people like Lionel Blair. You know, he was a bit of a joke figure in the mid-'80s. And I'd learned a lot more about what he meant to the British dance scene and all the people that he'd taught dance moves to and everything, you know. And I respected the era of 50s jazz a lot more than I did. I even liked Sade a lot more, you know. And Patsy Kensit had sort of taken on this weird sort of cult status by then, you know. She'd had the connection with Oasis and all of that, you know, and it now seemed to be a different sort of melting pot, seeing it in the year 2016 or the year 2019. And the crucial thing for me is that back in the mid-'80s, I'd not seen films like Beat Girl and What a Crazy World and Three Hats for Lisa, and these great British pop musicals of the late 50s and early 60s, Espresso Bongo and things like that, you know. And I'd since caught up with all of these movies and loved them all, and suddenly now realised where Julian had got a lot of his ideas from, you know, particularly Espresso Bongo. It's a very similar sort of film to that in terms of the way it looks at the cynical world of pop music and the cynical world of promotion of teenagers, and again the same sort of story that Julian had already told us in The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, you know, cynical managers manipulate their young chargers sort of thing. And right at the heart of that, you've got David Bowie as this manipulative background figure, Vendis Partners, dancing on a typewriter, singing Volare, you know, and being the puppet master. And yeah, I've changed my mind on Absolute Beginners. I now see the British film tradition that it fits into, but none of us did at the time, and we weren't encouraged to. And I think that was the film's failure. We were told to watch this film as a piece in itself, and it doesn't work as that. Where it does work is as a part of a certain strata of British film history.
I think one of the problems I had with it, it's not the problem. Actually, it's not a problem. But when I screened this, I wanted to show an 80s musical, and there isn't an 80s musical for a decade.
It isn't one.
For a decade that was such about advancing visual music and the music video and the birth of MTV and all that kind of stuff. There really isn't something that captures that 80s vibe of what a musical from the 80s could be. Because a lot of the 80s stuff seems to be referencing 50s and 60s.
As I say, there was this crop of films around 1959, 1960, 61.
Yeah.
And Julian's done his version of that. And none of us knew at the time. We weren't told that. And we weren't able to see those films at the time. And that's what he was aiming at. He'd obviously seen all these movies, but he didn't sort of present them to us. He just presented his own film to us and said, here's what I've done, without giving us any reference points. Yeah. And yeah, that's a brilliant point about it not being a film of its time, because it isn't.
But that seemed to be a trend in the 80s. There was a lot, like Roy Orbison was having a resurgence in his career in the 80s. Yeah. And it was like a lot of this, like, harking back to what was popular. Tiffany was new pop star, singing a song from the 60s. You know what I mean? There was a lot of that kind of 80s and the 50s and 60s being intertwined in some way, where the 80s never really had its own identity in some ways.
This always happens in Britain, though, because in the early 70s, you know, glam rock in the early 70s largely formed out of Mark Bolan's love of Chuck Berry in the 1950s. So there was a big rock and roll revival in Britain in sort of 1971, 72, and you got old rock and rollers coming over and touring over here, and people like Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis were playing, you know. So it seems to be part of the British psyche that we're always looking back 10 or 20 or 30 years. You know, we're sort of doing it now in certain aspects, and yeah, Absolute Beginners sort of fell foul of that in a way, but. The mistakes it made in doing that are now virtues, and I think they've become virtues because the audience have had a chance to sort of catch up and pick up on what Julian's references were.
I think one of the other things that occurred to me as I was watching it was Julian's style of filmmaking is starting to become more set in stone here.
Yeah, yeah.
You never get the feeling when you're watching a Julien Temple movie, particularly from the 80s, that you're watching real life. It's always you always feel like the characters are walking around in a set or inhabiting a world that's been created for your viewing pleasure, like Jazzin For Blue Jean.
He wants to enhance that. He wants to up that and put that in your face. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
It is artifice. Yeah, and he tells you it is. I mean, the massive set, the sort of Soho street set that they film on, is a movie set, but what a movie set. That's what he's saying to you. Look at this. We're going round this corner now. This is amazing. This is massive. You know, look at where I'm taking my characters now. We've got a car driving down the set. And it's similar to what Coppola did with The One from the Heart. You know, it's that type of filmmaking. It's putting that in your face. It's putting the make-believe up front, and then things like the when Ray Davies does the brilliant song "Quiet Life," and it's all done on that set, like the old Jerry Lewis set, where it's all different compartments and different rooms, and the characters are walking up and down stairs, and Julian just pulls his camera back and lets you look at the whole thing. You know, occasionally he'll focus or cut to one particular room or one particular little compartment of the set, but then he'll cut again and you'll be seeing 20 rooms and characters doing the hoovering or walking up and down stairs or reading a newspaper or whatever, and Ray Davies in the middle of it all, dressed in a sort of overall or sort of shabby looking sort of brown long overcoat, you know, is singing this brilliant sort of plaintive song. The whole thing's just magical. But again, it's magical because your attention is being drawn to the fact that it's a movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would carry on in his career, particularly with his next film, I think.
Definitely.
Which we'll get onto in a moment. One of the things that stood out to me was I didn't think the lead actor was right for the role, was good enough for the role, and that kind of lets it down a little bit.
I agree, but sometimes that can work in a film's favour, and I think it does. To give the film its due all these years on, as I'm now a fan of it, you know, I think that the weakness of the lead actor, and you're correct about that, but doesn't that serve to enhance the plot idea about manipulation? And doesn't it make Bowie's character, who's only on screen for a very short length of screen time, but it makes him look more Mephistophelian? You know, it brings in this sort of Faustian element to it, and it's very much how the relationship was between Larry Parnes and his stable of musicians at the time in 1959, in 1960.
For all your bashing of poor Patsy Kensit, I think she's great in this.
She's really good in it. I've grown to love her in this, and I think again it's because he's so weak. She really stands out as a vibrant, lively character, and she was when I saw the film in 1986. It's just I didn't want to know. I didn't want her to be good in it, you know. And now I accept that she is. She is the life and soul of the movie, and that has really come over in recent viewings. So time's been very, very good to the film and to her, I think.
Yeah, time has been good to this film. Time has been good for Patsy Kensit. Not so good for Goldcrest Films, though.
No.
This film led to the collapse of Goldcrest Films and sent Julien Temple scurrying back to America to do music videos and also do his next movie that we're going to talk about, Earth Girls Are Easy.
Yeah, well, I think Julian was always one of the British filmmakers who had one eye on Hollywood. You can tell that from the way he stages his music videos and he stages absolute beginners. You know, he was obviously a director that always wanted to break into Hollywood. And was Earth Girls Are Easy the way to do it, Adam?
It was the 80s, man. It was a different time. It was a different time, you know. It was like things that you pitch in any other decade would get you shown the door, but in the 80s, it was like you got Buckaroo Banzai in the 80s. You know, you got Howard the Duck in the 80s. You got Earth Girls Are Easy in the 80s.
Yeah, and it almost forms a trilogy with those two movies. You know, it's just its own thing. You know, it's this weird, mad, colourful fantasy movie. It's another film that I think has aged pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it taps into what when we said the last film wasn't very 80s for what you would expect from a 1986 musical. This Now this has the 80s. It's the 80s.
This is 80s, 1988, the movie. Yeah,
It really is. And I don't know whether that's as much to do with Julien Temple as it is to do with the production and Julie Brown, who wrote it and starred in it, alongside the duo of Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum.
Yeah, who were Hollywood's golden couple at the time.
They were certainly. Well,
had already worked together on a couple of movies. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is. I think they did 3 or 4 films together. And this was the last one, maybe.
Yeah, they did Transylvania 65000, which is where they met, and the most famous one, The Fly, which is their classic. But they're great in this. They're really, really good in this, and you can tell, how they feel about each other, and they really come packaged as a couple. Even though the plot of the film throws them together, but you can see there's a connection there and a chemistry.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I loved it. It was very 80s. It appealed to my 80s sense. What I love about the 80s. If you're going to do an 80s film, then you do an 80s film like this. You go full out. Whether that will hit because it was too 80s at the time, and maybe it was just not what people wanted. Who knows? Yeah.
How do you think that now would translate to an audience watching it 30 years later?
I think people would love it now. I think it's one of those films that actually, if it was made today, and we're making a movie that's like an 80s movie, they'd kind of make this movie now. So in some ways, it was ahead of its time by being so on the ball for documenting the whole craziness of the 80s.
It is bang on with every 80s cliche you can think of is in there, and they're all done brilliantly, and they're cliches for a reason. It's because they're good, it's not a massively original film in that sense, but it takes that unoriginality and really has fun with it. It really plays with it. And Julian is not averse to throwing in a big absolute beginners type musical number every now and then. There's the great one in the salon, near the start.
Whoa, we stop you there, Darrell. It's not just the salon. It's the curl up and die salon.
Curl up and die, yes, yeah.
Come on. When a pun like that is in a film, you don't ignore it, Darrell.
How perfect is that? And I mean, for people who don't know the plot of Earth Girls Are Easy, the title sort of tells you it's about aliens. It's these 3 sort of furry aliens beamed down to Earth in their little mini spaceship, which is so small it can fit into someone's swimming pool, and not only someone's swimming pool, but Gina Davis's pool. And she's going through a tough time with a partner, and he's sort of playing away and having affairs all over the place. And she's looking for late 80s love. And these 3 furry aliens beam down from whichever planet they're from. One of them's red, one's blue, one's yellow. So you've got this explosion of colour. Their spaceship looks like the yellow submarine. As I say, it's tiny. It fits into the swimming pool, but they've got the power to expand and grow. They can grow to human size. So because Gina works in a salon, they take the aliens down there to curl up and die, and they give them a makeover. It's 1988, of course they do, and they come out looking vaguely human, but still acting alien. One of them is, as well as Jeff Goldblum, you've got Damon Wayans in there, and you've got Jim Carrey in there in a very early role. Doesn't he come fully formed? He's already Jim Carrey. He's already got all the shtick and all the gurning and all the movement and madness. He's right there.
Well, it's fascinating because I'm currently going through a Rodney Dangerfield period. I don't think anyone's ever said that out loud before. But I'm currently going through I'm watching a lot of Rodney Dangerfield, and I'm reading his autobiography. And in the early 80s, Jim Carrey opened for Rodney Dangerfield. And he was saying he was doing impressions at the time. And it was during the period he was switching from impressions to his own comedy, was when Dangerfield had him on as his opening act. So he was performing in stand-up and stuff like that, and he explodes on the scene in '88 in this, perfectly formed, like you say, perfectly formed.
And really, really sort of steals the show when he's on screen. I think the Davis and Goldblum sort of relationship carries the movie and is a great sort of central core for the film. But then you suddenly cut to Carey doing his stuff, and you forget all about them for 2 minutes and just watch him being a whirlwind and a marvel.
Well, it's the classic 80s comic relief, isn't it? It's the classic, like,
oh yeah, yeah.
The secondary character providing comic relief to the romance story.
And let's not do Wayans down either, because he's really good in the film, and he's sort of in there trying to compete. But when you're up against Carey in that sort of form, you know, even Jeff Goldblum struggles. You know,
I think it's a fun film. It's an enjoyable film, and I think as a capsule of 80s things, it works perfectly. I don't think it's the one that's going to break Julien Temple as the next Hollywood big director.
Not at all. And it didn't do.
It didn't do, no. And I don't think it did much for anyone's career, really, when you look at the cast. I mean, like Gina Davis, didn't she win the Oscar for Accidental Tourist?
Yes, I think you could be right.
Period. Yeah, it was the same year. So she had in '87 she did like
so she was hot, yeah.
And then literally the next year she did Beetlejuice, which was a massive hit. And then she did The Accidental Tourist, which won her the Oscar. And then Earth Girls Are Easy came out. So it was on the back of two fairly big hits there.
Yes, yeah.
So really, there was no reason why this shouldn't have been a hit, even if it was just like bathing in the reflected glory of Davis's previous films.
I don't know how it did in America. It sort of bombed a bit over here. People didn't understand it in this country.
I think it bombed in America as well.
Yeah. But that's weird, because I think in the UK it was perceived as being we sort of wanted Temple to fail anyway, because he made a perceived disaster of Absolute Beginners, and then also I think the film just seemed a little bit too US centric for us, you know, and what were 80s cliches in America hadn't worked their way over to Scunthorpe, I don't think. You know, that was the thing, you know. It was just too colourful and too brash for us. But again, you know, time's done it a lot of favours, and it's a great movie now, you know. And I sense in your thinking there, Adam, and in some of the things you've referred to, I can sense your cinema programming head coming on, and an American 80s all-nighter starting to formulate. Howard the Duck, Buckaroo Banzai, and this at the core of it.
I just think the 80s is very much like, as I said earlier on, it's a decade where films that didn't get made in any other decade kind of got made in that decade, because it was I don't know, it was Hollywood it's a sort of like, we don't know what we're doing period, where they were taking chances that they wouldn't not have taken 15 years ago.
That may well explain why Julian got a job there, you know.
Sure, yeah. I guess the other thing as well is like filmmakers were having more access to other films. Yeah. You know, they were being able to see a lot more of the wealth of history. So Julien Temple's getting to see a lot of those 1950s and 60s British musicals that you wouldn't have been able to see unless you were there at the time. Whereas in the 80s, you started to get VHSs being released. You started to get a lot more of those films being recycled and re-put out. So then your referencing in films started to become more acute, I guess.
Yeah.
But it felt like if you hadn't seen these films, it was nothing for you in some ways. Or at least that was a perceived vision of that, maybe. I don't know anything about being a Valley girl, so I'm not going to enjoy Earth Girls Are Easy. It's like, everyone can enjoy Valley Girls. That's the whole point of the movie.
Yeah. And at heart, it's boy meets girl, you know, it's Alien meets Valley Girl, and that boils down to boy meets girl, which is a plot that we always love. So it's hard to do that wrong.
But as we said, it didn't really do his career much good, because he didn't direct another feature for a few years after that.
Yeah, I wonder what Julian's career plan and motives were. When did he want to establish a career in features, and would he have liked to have done that in Britain? Would he have liked to have done that in Hollywood? Because either way, that didn't work out for him, and he's really only made, you know, a small handful. I think there are only the three films that we're talking about here comprise most of his sort of fiction film career. You've got Absolute Beginners, Earth Girls Are Easy, and then in the mid-90s, there's this weird crime drama gangster type thing called Bullet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with Mickey Rourke, and it returned Julian to his template of utilising pop performers, in this case hip hop performers, with Tupac Shakur.
Yeah, which gives the film its sort of whatever lasting cult status it has, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at his IMDb here, and in between, you think, oh, okay, I'll just go from Earth Girls Are Easy to his next film, Bullet, and in between that, literally, he seems to be the hardest working man in music videos. In between those periods, he's directing 2 or 3 music videos a year between then and 1996. You know, with a whole manner of different artists as well. I mean, he continued to work with David Bowie with Tin Machine.
Yeah.
But as we said before, he worked with Janet Jackson. He worked with Eric B. and Rakim. He worked with Rolling Stones again. He's worked with those multiple times. He directed the video for Everything I Do It For You by Bryan Adams. And, you know, he just carried on and on and on. Duran, Blur, even into the 90s, he was directing some of the Britpop people.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure Julian would have been getting some sort of artistic satisfaction out of all that, but there's a sense with him that nagging at the back of his mind, he would have been working on a Duran video or whatever and thinking, I'm making a little mini movie here and I've got a massive budget and I've got these huge pop stars working with me. This is great, but I'd quite like to be pouring all of these resources into a 100-minute movie. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he did get the chance to sort of express himself artistically via the medium of sort of MTV. But I just get a feeling with him that he might have wanted more, and that he wanted that call back to Hollywood and real filmmaking. I don't know what you think, Adam.
I don't mean it's I guess it's more how we look at the music video. I think at the time, people were talking about music videos as being the art form, you know, the art form of the music video.
Yeah.
And I think
and a potential future, maybe.
Exactly, you know, in the sense of that, well, you know, this is what the 80s and the 90s are going to be about. It's going to be about the music video. And I don't think that's really happened. I think with the death of MTV, you know, 15, 20 years ago, whatever it was now, it's kind of taken away the historical importance of a lot of those music videos.
Yeah.
Whereas at the time, like I said, at the time, the budgets were ridiculous budgets.
They were. It was
videos, you know,
movie level. Yeah.
You've got an hour-long video for ABC. Mantrap, an hour long. Like, you know, what were the 80s thinking? You know, and now looking back on it, no one looks back on it and goes, "Oh yeah, this is a great document of the 1980s." They probably should. People don't look back at those pop videos as artistically important. I don't think. No,
I think they've aged pretty well as art, but I don't think they've aged in terms of respect and the way that people view them. They've become a little bit forgotten, I think, or dismissed.
Yeah, because I remember at the time, people, Martin Scorsese directing Bad for Michael Jackson.
Yes.
This is an important art form. We've got great directors directing it. I don't think that's held up over the years. So maybe at the time, Julian's thinking, actually, this is my legacy. I'm making all these great videos that in 30 years' time, people are going to look back on as great films, as mini movies, as the art form of the 80s and 90s. And yeah, I just don't. Sadly, I don't think that's come through.
Yeah.
Ironically, he's going to be known more for his absolute beginners than he is going to be known for his pop videos.
Yeah, which probably was never the plan for him, you know. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so he does this weird movie Bullet in the mid-90s. The film, one of the writers of the film is credited as Sir Eddie Cook, which is a fantastic name, and that turns out to be a pseudonym for Mr. Mickey Rourke.
Yeah.
So this is obviously a very personal project for him. I don't want to sound dismissive here, but I'm going to call it a pound shop gangster rap crime movie, you know. But put that in perspective, I would also call Walter Hill's Trespass a pound shop gangster rap crime movie, and I would call Training Day the same. And I think they're both great movies, and they both got cinema release, and Training Day won the Best Actor Oscar, you know. So, yeah, I'm not using that as a dismissive term, but I'm using it as a descriptive one, because this does come over as sort of in one sense, it's like 10 a penny. There are a million of these films out there. It's white guy in a hood, getting involved with criminals, lots of drug taking, lots of shady deals, lots of characters mooching about warehouses, lots of graffiti. But as with Walter Hill, as with Training Day, Anton Fuqua, that was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Julian does a great job on this. He makes a really interesting film, and it's a good vehicle for Mickey Rourke. As a sort of personal project, it's a very good sort of vehicle for him. It's very, very notable, as you say, for having Tupac in it, because it turns it into a cult movie instantly. And the film, of course, came out. Yeah,
it came out 2 months after he was killed. So it had all the ingredients to be a massive hit, really. In that period, people upset and desperate to see more Tupac, and they just lost him. And like we said, there's only a handful of Tupac films. There's not like he wasn't the most prolific of actors in features, but he was just starting to break in. He'd done things like Above the Rim, Poetic Justice, Juice being one of the big ones from that early period. And he just started to move out beyond the sort of like Boys in the Hood, gangster neighborhood things into more plot lines. Not that far away from that in this particular movie, but with more like the story-based stuff. So he'd done like plot-based stuff like crime plot with Bullet, and then he also did the one with Tim Roth called Gridlocked, which wouldn't come out the following year, which was actually a really good film. But for me, there's not much. I remember watching this film when it came out. It was a big hit on video. It was, blockbuster. But
it's that sort of movie, as I say.
Exactly.
It is. If it wasn't straight to video, it sort of ought to have been, but then deserved to be a success on video, because it's very much of that type. It's good of that kind. The thing that really impressed me about it, I like Adrian Brody in it as Mickey Rourke's brother. The brother they've got in the attic, this is the horror movie fan in me coming out. Ted Levine's character is the weirdo in the attic. And my God, Mickey Rourke's part should be the show part in the movie. And Ted Levine just comes on and he goes method on it. It's just fantastic. You can't take your eyes off him. He's got this little pet rat that he sort of plays around with. He's obviously sort of doing ad-libbing and doing all kinds of weird little shtick, and he's fantastic. I love him. I think he becomes, for me, what the reason why I'm watching the film more than the basic plot. I want to see more of him in it. And of course, that feeds into the film's ending, where we not to give anything away, but Ted plays a big part unexpectedly in the film's finale. So
it does, however, have a real lack of Julien Temple's stylistic quirks that you would expect to see in one of his movies had you only seen his 80s films.
Yeah, it's very generic. Yeah, and it's not colourful either.
No, not at all. It's that's stood out for me as well. If you watch Absolute Beginners, Earth Girls Are Easy, it's a riot of colour, and then this is very much sort of like casting shadows, dark, muted colours. It's not
a Julian choice either. He's just imitating what's been done in other films that are like it.
Yeah, I mean, in that way, it reflects the genre that it's being made in.
Yeah.
But he doesn't bring anything to it.
You don't want that. You don't want that from Julian. You want Julien Temple to make a Julien Temple film. You want that colour, you want that explosion. There's occasions where it tries to break out here. The scenes in the nightclubs, there's a great scene where there's dialogue going on at a table, important dialogue between two major characters at a table, but it's in the distance, it's in the background of the scene. And what Julian shows us in the foreground is dancers shimmying and shaking, and moving back and forward across the screen. And there's music playing, and it's great. It's not, the colours are a bit muted, but the sense is there that this is a scene that is like something that could have been in Absolute Beginners. it's so hard to watch, in a sense, in that you're enjoying the scene for what it is, but you're thinking, if Julian had been given his head here, this could have been so much more. There is that sense of him being a little bit neutered here. Whereas Ted Levine isn't. Ted Levine is off the leash, you know, and you wish Julian could have been a little bit more on this. Maybe Mickey Rourke's calling the shots. I don't know.
Possibly. Maybe it was more of a higher job.
Maybe it was difficult production, but it's a good little film. It's good of its kind, and you know we don't want to do it down. And it's got great things in it.
Yeah. So let's move on to our final film. That we're going to talk about is Glastonbury, the 2006 documentary about Glastonbury. In between Bullet and the 10 years in between Bullet, I think he was suddenly became fairly prolific. You know, from having like a massive gap from Earth Girls Are Easy to Bullet, he directed 3 films in the 10 years. He directed Vigo, A Passion for Life. He directed the Filth and Fury documentary, which you've already talked about, and he directed Pandemonium in 2000. So he suddenly had got a little bit of a, come on, let's get my finger at him, start making some movies. So maybe it was that itch that hadn't been scratched from making so many pop videos and having to do things to certain blueprints. Gave him a bit of a desire to get back into filmmaking.
But I think what we really need to talk about here, Adam, is to use Glastonbury as a way in to talk about how Julian, I think in the 21st century, wouldn't you agree, he's found his forte, or he's found one thing that he likes doing, which is returning again and again and again and again to music themes, to themes of modern music, and presenting them in a documentary style and presenting them as a part of long form British history, you know, saying that Dr. Feelgood and Joe Strummer and the Kinks and Wilko Johnson, they've got interesting stories to tell, and there are interesting stories that he can tell about them, but he sets that within not only the period of British history that they existed in and bringing that up to date, but also going back and looking at past politics and past social situations, and depicting these pop heroes of his as historical figures in the great British landscape. And Glastonbury is almost a perfect starting point for that, because you know the Glastonbury Festival has always sort of pitched itself in terms of just through its location more than anything, you know, in terms of ancient Britain and ancient British history, you know, and bringing that into the modern era. And Julian's all over that in his films. And this film in particular is great. I think it captures Glastonbury at a time when it was just starting to get a little bit commercial, but it hadn't tipped over. You hadn't got people like Tom Watson going to it then, you know, and Ed Balls and people like that, you know. It was still had remnants of what it used to be, you know, and I think Julian captured it just at the right moment in 2006. He feeds into this film the idea that things are changing. There are stories about the travelling community not being quite so welcome as they once were, and Michael Eavis, who was matey with them and who always invited them onto the site, and had a relationship with them where if the travellers worked on site, he would allow them into the festival for free and that sort of thing, or if they picked up litter and so on, you know. And suddenly that relationship seems to have got a little bit more fractious, and that's depicted in the documentary. There's also the, unrelated to that, you've got the idea that other groups of people are starting to break into the festival for free, and so again, a little bit under protest, under pressure from the local council, Michael Eavis has to erect this enormous security fence. And Julian not only shows us the plans for that fence and the physical object itself, but he shows us how people are trying to get around it and how they're still trying to break in. And he also spends a night out with the security guys, and he's sort of driving around the perimeter of the fence with a very, very typical bouncer-like British security team, you know, and it's sort of starting to show us the other side of Glastonbury, the side that isn't all hippy-dippy and isn't necessarily adhering to Michael and the Eavis family's original intent. But yeah, it's a fascinating documentary. Great use of, as always with Julian, as in all his punk and music documentaries, brilliant use of old news footage and old shots of politicians and scenes of British disasters and so on. He's obviously got this mountain of sort of old footage, library of old footage that he can go and play with. And he always manages to bring it into films like Glastonbury. The Dr. Feelgood documentaries, the Feelgood one, Oil City Confidential, and then the solo one that he did with Wilko Johnson, are great for this because they note that Wilko was actually born about 4 or 5 years before the other members of Dr. Feelgood. And so he was 5 or 6 when a massive flood hit Canvey Island and everyone had to sort of go up on the roofs of their houses. And he's showing footage, newsreel footage of this, but then getting Wilko to talk about it, because it would have been like his earliest memory. And the other members of Dr. Feelgood would have been like a year old or 6 months old when this was happening. So they've heard all about this disaster sort of second or third hand through the family. But Wilko, it's like his formative years. He was like 6 when it happened, and Julian's great at using old newsreel footage and old local history and things like that. He does it in the Pistols film, he does it in the Joe Strummer one, but it's great in Glastonbury. It's really, really good how he uses old footage. And one technique that he did in the film was he got other people to send in their film footage from previous festivals. And then this then becomes an editing job for him. And again, this seemed to be something that he loves, is stitching bits of film together and juxtaposing bits of film. He can tell a story through an edit. I think he was filming there, the year he filmed there mainly was 2003, I think, and the film came out in 2006. And he makes the 2003 Glastonbury Festival look like a sequel to Mad Max. He's got all these crazy cars and people in weird costumes and so on, and he picks out these strange figures. Like there's someone who's dressed as a bride, and she's sort of wandering around the field shouting at people, "The wedding's off! The wedding's off!" And he doesn't explain this. He doesn't tell you what her story is. He doesn't stop her and interview her. Like if someone was making a documentary now, or if the BBC was covering the festival now, they'd stop these people and they'd say, because they're still there, these figures like this still go to Glastonbury, but they'd be stopped on camera. You'd get Lauren Laverne or somebody trying to explain to the viewer what's your story? Why are you dressed like this? Julian doesn't tell us. He just lets us see these figures, people dressed as giant penguins and stuff, people holding up weird signs. And we never find out their story.
I guess that's the filmmaker in him, isn't it? In the sense that he's like, you're creating a myth about Glastonbury. And if you have someone in a wedding dress walking around their weddings off, and then you get Lauren Laverne explaining why she's doing that, it kind of ruins the myth. Exactly. The myth is there, having these characters wandering around, interacting. And I think Julian gets that. He gets that it's much about the audience as it is about the acts on stage, Glastonbury.
Yeah, he treats the acts in a very similar way in the film. He just shows you a brief glimpse of them, 30 seconds, a minute of their performance, doesn't tell you who they are, doesn't feel the need to tell you. They're just all part of the overall flow, and it's brilliant the way it's done.
Yeah, and like you say, it is a period of Glastonbury, those early 2000s, mid 2000s, where it was changing, and it was, literally
it's in flux. Yeah.
And also like just the types of artists that got to play Glastonbury. In 2006 when this came out, you've got like your stereotypical Paul Weller type acts on stage. 2 years later, you've got Jay-Z headlining. To a lot of controversy, thinly veiled racism, etc., etc. But that's the way Glastonbury was going. It was broadening what it perceived as major acts and important acts. So you got Jay-Z and you got Kanye and you got all these different like people that hadn't played Glastonbury before suddenly become headlining, and he captures that mood.
When it is Jay-Z, you can sort of go with it and you can sort of say, I can see what Michael Eavis is doing here. He's keeping pace with the times, It's when we're now in sort of 2020 and there's no festival this year, but I can imagine the 20s headliners and what they're going to be like, and it's going to be another shift on from that, and it does seem to be getting more and more broadly commercial and losing sight a little bit of what it was. And I think Julian's film is almost made at the perfect time because he can tell the entire story, and he almost does sort of start predicting the future of the event as well, not necessarily in terms of acts, but in terms of how it might become more commercialized. He focuses on the security fence in particular. Again, doesn't tell you anything. There's no voiceover commentary or anything, but the impression you get as a viewer from looking at those stark images of this fence are, this festival's not quite what it was. You know, it's losing its way a little bit. It's losing sight of why it started in the first place.
But also, is it saying that music isn't quite what it was as well?
Maybe.
Is the music industry so much more commercial now?
Julian obviously thinks so, because the subjects he's covered in his documentaries since have been people like Dr. Feelgood. He's not made a film about the Kinks, but weirdly, this is Julian all over and how he sort of treats his subjects. He never made a film about the Kinks, but he made one about Ray Davies, and then the following year he made one about Dave Davies. That's how he works, you know. But the fact that he's covering artists like that, rather than thinking about going back to Glastonbury or doing anything more about that, I think tells you where his sympathies lie in terms of what's happening to music.
I think when you spend the early 2000s directing S Club 7 videos, it can tend to warp your vision of music, doesn't it?
yeah, I guess so.
Cool. Okay, shall we draw a line under Julien Temple there, Darrell?
I think that's Julian done. Yeah.
We have got interesting things to look forward to, though, from Julien Temple. He's working on a Shane MacGowan documentary.
Yeah.
Which could be fascinating. And he's also working on a biography of Marvin Gaye. So 2 very interesting subjects with fascinating life stories bringing to the screen. So we shall look forward to that, I think. Cool. Lovely. Thank you very much, Darrell. I hope people are going to go out and track down Julien Temple's stuff. Earth Girls Are Easy. Go for it. You'll love it. I think there's lots of interesting stuff out there if you want to delve into Julien Temple's career, which ironically is also a career documenting the history of British music as well, in some ways, a certain strategy.
Definitely.
So thank you very much, Darrell, and we'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, thanks for listening, folks. Hope you enjoy it.